Hello everyone, it's really great to be here. This is Develop Performant E-commerce with Nuxt and Shopify. My name is Justin Metros, Head of Technology at Universal Standard and a member of the Forbes Technology Council. And over the last 18 months, we have deployed and iterated on a headless e-commerce site that was built with Nuxt, Shopify, Prismic, and Layer 0. And I'm here today to share my experience and provide tips and tricks on how to get started with Nuxt for e-commerce. So we knew we wanted to go headless, and there were some signs that we outgrew our traditional Shopify theme. We knew that we needed to be faster, and we also wanted more control over our server. And also, the authoring experiences that Shopify provided didn't necessarily reflect our content, and we also wanted a better developer experience. And there were some challenges we faced along the way. The pandemic caused the closing of all of our retail spaces, which meant that 100% of our revenue was coming from online sales. This meant that our website was more important than ever for the business. We also have a relatively small team of a few developers and a modest budget. So we decided that we wanted to move to the Jamstack, which allowed us to choose the best tools for the job. And the API-first approach allowed us to customize everything that we could get data for. It also gave us a finer level of systems control and allowed us to create an excellent developer experience. And just to qualify some of the benefits that we saw when we went headless, we saw a 200% increase in mobile session duration, 200% increase in mobile conversion rate, 40% lower bounce rate, 100% increase in pages per visit, 40% increase in average order value, and that's with 70% of our traffic coming from mobile in 2021. So along the way in our Jamstack journey, we chose Nuxt, and I have to say that everything was awesome. We love Vue. We were using Vue components in our Shopify theme, so Nuxt was a natural next step for us. There's logical conventions. It's very high performance, especially Nuxt 3. Props to the Nuxt team on that. It's amazing. There's a very supportive community, especially the Discords and with all the open source projects out there. And the Vue and Nuxt dev tools are just great. It makes developing with those tools a pleasure. So I want to talk about the build process and what we call our incremental migration. So by incremental migration, we had this really large Shopify theme. It's been around for a while. There's a lot going on there. And for us to replicate all of that, to migrate all at once, was kind of out of the question. We needed a way that we could migrate pieces at a time. And we realized that we didn't need to build everything at once to go live with headless. So we chose a deployment platform that allowed us to split our routes based on different backends. And we chose Layer 0 for this. And what that meant was that we could start building key elements in pages, like our global header and footer, our home page, collection pages, product pages, and our cart. So basically, your classic shop flow, and move that to headless and have those routes point to our headless deployment, while everything else that was still in our Shopify theme was being proxied by our platform. That allowed us to create and release content as we went. So we created the initial shop flow, we migrated that over to headless, but everything else, still Shopify. And then we started calling those our legacy pages, for lack of a better term. And once we had our shop flow running on Nuxt headless, we then prioritized our content based on its SEO value and its value to the company. We also split our traffic so we could see the difference between how our headless pages were performing versus our Shopify theme pages. And in almost every metric that we measured, our headless site was the winner by a fairly large margin, especially in speed. It couldn't be matched by the Shopify theme. So speaking of speed, if you want to reach like ludicrous speed, those crazy fast pages, you need to be caching at the edge. And caching is something that I learned a lot about on the journey to moving to headless. And one big thing is that cache control is critical. So one thing that we do is we break our routes out into different cache keys. So the finer grained cache keys, the better. So when content changes, you don't want to go in and blow out all your cache. You want to maintain as much as that as possible. It's kind of like the point of the cache. So we use cache keys specific to each route. So if we're updating a specific product page, we can go in and purge the cache just for that one route. Another thing with cache is establishing how long that cache lives for, the TTL. So for us, we really took a look at our content and how often it updates and used that to kind of inform how long our cache lives for. So we have some cache that lives for like a week, and then we have some other pieces of cache that might live just for a couple hours. So I recommend that you take a look at how often your content updates and apply a TTL on your cache that's in line with that. Another big one is cache your API responses whenever possible. This allows you to skip the network call because you already have the API response in the cache. Now, if you're using Shopify Headless, you're using the storefront API, which is GraphQL, and we really benefited from using a GraphQL client. We use Apollo, and both the Nuxt.js Apollo package and Vue Apollo are great tools. We used Nuxt.js Apollo for a real long time. Only recently, because of there were a couple of business reasons, we then took Vue Apollo and created our own like plugin around it. But both of these things with Apollo are just really great. Another tip when working with Apollo that we use is to set up 2 client configs. One with an in-memory cache, but then have another one that has a no cache fetch policy. And we use that no cache Apollo client for anything that has to do with the cart. So we found that when you have users adding, removing, changing quantities, when you have cache kind of sitting in between there, it can get in the way. So anything related to like the cart or checkout, we use the no cache Apollo client. It takes it out of the equation and simplifies us having to deal with cart in any checkout data. So when we're talking about going headless, we're talking about performance and optimization, things we always need to be mindful of. One of the biggest performance gains is using a service worker. So we use Nuxt.js PWA. I mean, just by installing this, we saw a performance boost right out of the box. Highly recommend it. We're hosted on layer 0, and they have a tool for predictive prefetching. And it's kind of like in Nuxt, when you wrap things in a Nuxt link, it's like fetching those things kind of automatically. And predictive prefetching, it takes a similar approach, but it's a little bit more nuanced, where it's only prefetching the things that we think, based on the viewport, what the user is going to be needing next. Because we found that when there's so much prefetching going on, especially for mobile users on not the best network speed, all that prefetching doesn't necessarily mean a performance increase. So we're really mindful with our prefetching. I mean, it goes without saying, if you're going with Nuxt in 2022, prioritize your asset optimization. When it comes to images, just serve up exactly what the user needs. The Nuxt image package is absolutely phenomenal. I highly recommend it. Another tip, always set your width and height on your image tags. This is going to minimize cumulative layout shift. You can get the width and height of an asset in Shopify through the GraphQL endpoint for it. And also inline everything you can. We have lots of icons and SVGs, and we use Nuxt.js SVG to inline all that stuff. There's no need to go to a server to grab those assets. So a big one is persisting and syncing your state. When it comes to like having a user with a cart, you definitely don't want them losing their checkout ID. So make sure that you're maintaining that session data on browser refreshes. And we use Vuex persistent state for that. And what this does is it takes your Vuex state, whatever state that you configure for it, and it mirrors it into local storage. And then when you refresh or rehydrate your app, Vuex persistent state takes that object out of local storage and hydrates your state with it. So user can refresh and you're not like losing your checkout ID. Another thing is we found that our users, they'll be shopping on our site and they'll have multiple tabs open. And it could be easy for them to get out of sync. So it's something that you need to be mindful of using Storefront API and Nuxt. We use a package called Vuex multi-tab state. It's really fantastic at solving this problem and keeping multiple tabs in sync with a local storage object. Another just must-have for us is real user monitoring. Now, when we're developing, we're using Lighthouse and checking the lab data, but Google's not using the lab data for ranking. It's using field data. And that's where a dedicated RUM tool really pays dividends. So we use Layer 0 RUM package. Now, regardless of where you're being deployed, you can use this package on any platform. And it makes it really easy to see, like on this specific route, there's a spike and, oh, there's an image that's not optimized there. It allows you to really take a look at what your users are seeing across all devices, all different kinds of network speeds, and it allows you to identify and fix those things pretty easily. Another must-have is an error monitoring tool. Things are going to break. They're going to break on the server. You might not always see logs for them, like when you're developing in your console, and you want to be able to catch these things. Not only that, but you want to aggregate them. You want to know how often they're happening, what devices they're happening on, and that's going to help you prioritize and triage them. Two great packages, Nuxt.js if you're /Sentry, if you're using Sentry, and if you're using Airbrake, the Airbrake browser. Both of these Nuxt friendly and highly recommended. So up next, just a few additional tips and tricks. These are a little bit more specific, things that I learned along the way that caused me some headache, and I hope to save you the same headaches that I experienced. One is dealing with the Shopify Storefront API. This is a big one. You need to stay within the API rate limits. Now, when you're using the Storefront API, this isn't advertised, but it does not respect the X-forwarded for header, at least not at the time of this presentation. So what that means is, even though your users are making requests, if you're on an edge network, Shopify can see them as coming from that edge IP. So that's something you need to be mindful of. Make sure you're checking your headers, and I do recommend you check in with Shopify to make sure you're staying within your limits. Another thing is to cache your API responses whenever possible, as mentioned earlier. And also, if you're making a lot of API calls or complex calls, like let's say you're doing filtering on a collection page with a really complex GraphQL query, make sure you're throttling that. And if you are hitting the rate limit or do hit it, make sure that you're handling those errors. Don't let it fall silently. Catch that and either fix it in the back end or show something to the user. Just don't let it fail. That could break things. Another is prioritize your cart management. Initially we didn't create a checkout ID or a cart, depending on what API you're using, until like a user went to add something to cart. But we realized pretty quickly that it was beneficial to have that cart or checkout ID right away. So what we do is, as soon as our app loads and the app's kind of in its like first idle state, we then go ahead and async create that checkout ID. And you also want to store that in a cookie. You don't want to use it, and it's really useful to be able to use that on the server and in the client. Another tip, I kind of mentioned this before, but it's really beneficial to dispatch some actions on rehydration to make sure that your local state of your cart, like what a user's added, just be checking that reflects like what Shopify thinks is in the cart. You don't want to fall out of sync there. And, depending on your app and, how it's set up, that can happen. So, it's a tip to just be mindful of that. Another one is to really try to minimize any issues you have with inventory. So, if you're server-side rendering a page or statically generating a product page, that's going to have inventory levels at the time it was generated. But if you have something that's being rendered from cache, or you have data that is from the time it was generated, your inventory is maybe off, depending on the time that lapsed and how much traffic you're getting to your shop. So what we do is we server-side render all of our product pages, and then as soon as those product pages mount in the client, we go ahead and fetch the latest inventory. And that way we know that when a user is interacting with like a size selector, that's an accurate representation of what's actually available in Shopify. And by doing that, it allows us to have our product pages with a longer cache life, because our images and options on a product might not change that often. Reviews might get published a few times a day, or maybe every other day, but inventory is constantly changing. So fetch inventory like right away in the client, and then you can have a longer cache life for your product pages. So this is a big one. Third parties can and will destroy your performance if you let them. So only load what's critical up front. So maybe like GA and things that are like mission critical for your app. Anything else, if you can, if it's non-essential, wait like at least until the user's shown some intent. So for us, we don't load any third parties like reviews or email capture widgets or modals until there's at least like a mouse move or a touch start or a scroll event. And this helps to get our largest contentful paint times down, and it generally like increases our speed of our site. Another one, so this might seem like a no-brainer, but I think it should be mentioned, is scroll restoration. The Nuxt router has scroll options. So like if a user is on a collection page and they've scrolled down a bit and they go to a product page and click back, you can use the Nuxt router scroll options to put them back where they were. And then, if a user is navigating to a new page, you could bring them to the top of that. So this might not apply to all platforms, but it's a big game changer for us, is being able to auto-purge cache when that underlying content changes. So what we did was we created an endpoint in our Nuxt app that accepts a Shopify webhook request. And we use Layer2Zero as our deployment platform, and that actually has an API that we can use to programmatically purge the cache at a specific key. So what we do is if one of our members of our ecom team is adding a new product or updating images in a product, and that triggers the product update webhook, that then goes to our app, which then purges the cache for that route. So we know when some content is changed in Shopify that our users are getting that change immediately. And that really beats having to go in and manually purge your cache out. Another big one is that analytics, if you're going headless, they require special care. I recommend using a server-side GTM container if possible. A big one, beware of the ghost referral, especially if you're headless and using Shopify checkout, you're probably crossing domain. Google ghost referral. There's a lot of good resources out there on how to get around it. Just be mindful of it, because that one will bite you. And also, if you care about your e-commerce and you're getting really granular, you probably want to capture a full e-commerce object and send that up. Take your response that you get from Storefront API and fully build that e-commerce object yourself and push that up onto your data layer. So, I was really excited about this conference, so I made a thing. And that thing is Nuxt Shop. And it's an opinionated starter kit built with Nuxt 3, Pinia, Apollo, Tailwind 3, and Layer2Zero. All the latest, my favorite, cool stuff. And I built this because the Shopify Storefront API has a noticeable lack of Vue or Nuxt resources. If you go to their GitHub repo, you'll see React, Node, Angular, but nothing for Vue. And this is the project that I wish I saw when I got started on my headless journey. So Nuxt Shop, it's just an open source starting point with some configurations so that you could be productive quickly with the Shopify Storefront API. It has some minimally styled components. It's opinionated but not prescriptive. And what it's not It's not a theme. It's not a plug-and-play production-ready store or a design system, and it's not tightly coupled to any tool. It's there if you're interested in going headless with Shopify to have some configuration and kind of demonstrate how we do things. And if you want to give it a shot, it's open source on GitHub at justinmetro/nuxtshop. And the easiest way to try it out is through a one-click deploy that the team at Layer Zero has offered to host at try.layerzero.com/nuxtshop. And I hope you enjoyed that. I hope you got something out of this talk. Thank you very much, and good luck on your headless adventures with Shopify.